The current onslaught against Gary Lineker tells you more than you need to know about the burning skip that is modern British society. Now, this country, and the world in general, is in a state of chaos. There is a vicious war taking place in Europe, an unprecedented collapse in living standards here and elsewhere for that matter, a climate emergency which threatens our future existence, kind of important, an NHS that's in a state of collapse, the Tories are lurching from crisis to scandal to crisis to scandal. We could go on. Now, have a little guess. What was the main story on the BBC 10 o'clock news last night? Yeah, that's right. Just to be clear, it was a tweet. A tweet by a sports presenter. That's the main news, apparently. That's the most important thing going on in the world, according to the editors of the 10 o'clock news. They looked at everything happening. They went, do you know what? I think we should go on this tweet by Gary Lineker. Now, that tweet, which I'll talk about, which was criticising the government's policy towards migrants and refugees, that tweet criticising a government is a bigger scandal than the government defying international law in its vicious crusade against migrants and refugees, pledging to kick out people wherever they're from or wherever they've fled, like Afghanistan, where this country was engaged in armed conflicts for 2 decades. That fact underlies just how messed up our democracy happens to be at this current juncture. Now, some might go, oh, you're just backing Gary Lineker because he's one of yours, you're like-minded, etc., etc. Not true. I'm a socialist. Gary Lineker isn't. He's essentially, and I say this with no animosity, like a lot of people, I've got a fair bit of affection towards Gary Lineker, but he's basically a centrist dad, which I realise is a term when I use some actual centrist dads think is some sort of slur. It isn't. It just is what it is. He's a centrist dad. Now, when Lineker tweeted Bin Corbyn, there was no massive hysteria about breaking objectivity and all the rest of it, expressing his opinions from the right-wing media, was there? They didn't clutch their pearls and go, oh, sack him, this is an outrage. Now, these are the same crew now, because the Daily Mail, etc., and now they want Gary Lineker out. They want him to be fired by the BBC. This is the same crew who talk about cancel culture, about the attack on free speech, about how you can't express an opinion anymore without someone trying to get you fired, as in the woke mob, which is what they're talking about, rather than the actual right-wing mob, which runs most of our newspapers in this country. They're demanding Lineker is out, fired, sacked for expressing his opinion. Now, the hypocrisy gets even worse. I mean, actually, just need to calm myself down because it is actually quite annoying. This is actually annoying. Lineker's a sports commentator. He's not a news reporter or a political journalist. If he was a political journalist and he was just willy-nilly expressing political opinions, that would be a problem because it would raise very obvious question marks about his objectivity. I don't really think his views on refugees and migrants compromises his views on whether the Everton manager happens to be doing a good job at the moment. Now, given we're talking about political journalists, this is where hypocrisy comes in. Do you remember Andrew Neil? Andrew Neil. Yeah, you know that guy. The guy who was the flagship politics presenter of the BBC until he went, by the way, and tried launching the overtly right-wing station GB News, except that turned out to be a Frankenstein's monster. When he was a flagship presenter for the BBC, he constantly used his Twitter feed to promote right-wing causes, criticising the scientific consensus on climate change, reviling what he called the climate mafia, goodness grief, and claiming that deviation from the consensus means the witch finders want to burn you. Yeah, very much objective there. That was when he was working for the BBC. But more to the point, he was and is the chairman of the hard-right Spectator magazine, one of the most right-wing mainstream publications in Britain, which is quite the bar, I have to say, to pass. Where was the hysteria about Andrew Neil? Where was it? I wrote a column about it. I didn't call for him to be fired, by the way. I just pointed out, I used it as a case study about the idea that the BBC was some den of leftiness was obviously horseshit. To be brutally honest and frank, I think you want me to be honest and to the point. Well, here I am. Now, the Daily Mail didn't go around demanding he get fired, did he? Because he was... The key thing here is, as I've said, he was chairman of a very right-wing newspaper, magazine, whatever, rag, to be more accurate, used his Twitter feed to just express political opinions. The Daily Mail weren't demanding he got fired. Quite the contrary. As James O'Brien at LBC points out, fire him, they hired him. Yeah, that's right. Andrew Neil is a Mail columnist now, where he merrily spouts his right-wing opinions, because it was always clear that he was a right-winger. Now, as it happens, and this is separate, because Andrew Neil, politics journalist, Gary Lineker, sports commentator, very different. So there was actually a legitimate critique to be made of Andrew Neil. But of course, at the time when I made it, I just got piled on, including, I have to say, by a lot of people who would consider themselves centrist. So how did that work out for you guys? Now, I mean, I'd actually prefer public figures like Lineker to be open and honest about their views, even when I disagree with them, rather than doing that thing that some do, which is pretending to be objective while slyly just injecting their opinions in, whilst, they're like, oh, no, but what they pick and choose to talk about and all the rest of it reveals what they actually think, even as they hide behind objectivity. But look, not only is Lineker being monstered, he's got journalists camped outside his home asking him questions. What on earth is going on here? No, but seriously, we're literally holding now. We've got journalists doing more to hold a sports commentator to account over a tweet than we have many government ministers who are inflicting absolute misery on the people of this country and people elsewhere. Now, to repeat what Lineker actually said, because it keeps getting misrepresented, he said, there is no huge influx. We take far fewer refugees than other major European countries. This is just an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 1930s. Am I out of order? So firstly, some basic facts. Now, it is firstly true that there are significantly fewer people claiming asylum in Britain than in the early 2000s. That's a fact, even though globally the number of people who've been driven from their homes has massively gone up. So we're taking a much smaller percentage of a significantly much bigger refugee population. Now, most of those who are displaced internally in their own country by a narrow majority. And of the less than half who flee their country, 69% are in neighbouring states. Rich countries take just over a quarter, and that number has been massively inflated by the war in Ukraine. Before that, they're only taking 15%. The rest were all in poor countries, and Britain is taking far fewer than France or Germany. Now, as for the language being not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 1930s, well, look, I think the point here to be made is that the greatest atrocities in history did not begin with mass murder. They began with words. All horrors in history begin with words. When Suella Braverman describes migrants and refugees as an invasion, what does that mean? Well, obviously it's an attempt to conjure up a hostile force, a dangerous force, which threatens your civilization and threatens you and your families. That's what it talks about. It's accompanied by vicious rhetoric in the media. Remember The Sun publishing a column by Katie Hopkins comparing migrants to cockroaches and feral humans spreading like norovirus, suggesting gunships be used against them. Pretty Nazi-like, I'd say that. Some of you go, oh, well, it's Katie Hopkins. Oh, she's an outlier. She's not representative. That was published in the biggest, most influential newspaper in the country, other than perhaps the Daily Mail. And do you really want to go there? The fact is, migrants and refugees are constantly dehumanised and defamed on a daily basis in this country. We're not living under Nazism. That isn't actually what Gary Lineker said, though. Learning the lessons of the past doesn't mean looking at the most extreme endpoints. It means looking how we arrived at that point in the first place and how it all began. Now, the systematic demonisation and othering of Jews and minorities is what led to Auschwitz, Birkenau and Treblinka. There's no other way of concluding otherwise. That's what the history books tell us. That doesn't mean we're going to end up there. What it does mean is our history teaches us that we should always be on guard when hatred and bigotry towards minorities descends into total, unapologetic hysteria, whipped up by a state which will disregard anything, the law, morality, in its war on very marginalised people. And that's another point, by the way. There's another point here. Gary Lineker is filling a vacuum left by the Labour Party. Where's the Labour Party in all of this? Showing moral leadership, taking apart the lies? Well, if you think they're going to do that, you're going to be gutted. Listen to what Keir Starmer said in Parliament.
And what happens to the rest? They sit in hotels and digs for months on end at the taxpayers' expense.
They sit in hotels and digs for months on end at taxpayers' expense. That's the rhetoric of the hard right. That's what he's indulging. And indeed, when Rishi Sunak denounced him for being soft on immigration, he denounced that by responding, that when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, that he'd extradited countless rapists. What the hell was he doing there? He was equating, unintentionally or otherwise, migrants and rapists in the public mind. That is an absence, an abdication of leadership. And that's why you end up with sports pundits filling the vacuum. Now, there is a nonsense here of BBC impartiality because they go, oh, we're tapped by the right, we're tapped by the left. That's a logical fallacy. So, for example, if you look at the criminal justice system and go, well, the left say we're too punitive and the right say we're not harsh enough, therefore we've got the criminal justice system right. It doesn't work like that. at the end of the day, it works based, well, the argument should be what's the actual content, the substance, and that's how we should judge it, not by, the fact that the right in this country, because they dominate all the newspapers, that unless you get every media organisation screaming right-wing rhetoric, that lot think it's bias, because their idea of neutrality is basically hard right propaganda. Now, the nonsense of the illegal immigration bill is being lost in all of this, that the government has clamped down on safe and legal routes, which is why even though we have fewer asylum seekers than we used to have, more arriving by boats because there isn't an alternative means for them to arrive. Aspects like those arriving here by boats won't be eligible for modern slavery protections. Absolute godsend that for traffickers, because now their victims won't be able to go and seek help from the state because they'll just be deported immediately if they do. The boats will still arrive. And this is simply driving up public anger about the issue, making it more of an issue, which all it will do when the boats are still arriving, people, the promises that the government have made to a certain section of the population who've become radicalised on this issue, it will just open up space for right-wing demagogues who will just fill that vacuum. And they will eat up the Tories as well. So actually the Tories are digging their own grave, not in a good way, because we're going to end up with people who are even worse. All this is trying to do is deflect, above all else, from collapsing living standards. The Tories are presiding over collapsing living standards, collapsing public services, and an unprecedented, if you like, decline in life in what is a rich country. And they just want us to be angry at refugees and migrants, and angry at anyone who has the temerity to say we shouldn't be blaming migrants and refugees for all the problems in society. We should be taking on the people at the top, including the government, who have frankly taken this country to the very edge of the abyss. So enough is enough. Enough of this faux outrage from a bunch of right-wing hypocrites and charlatans, including those who've cheerled the government as they plunged this country into turmoil and chaos and stripped people, millions of people, of the living standards that they should expect in a rich country. That's not the fault of refugees and migrants. It's not the fault of Gary Lineker. It's the fault of the people at the top. Please like, subscribe, support us on patreon.com/ownjose84. I'll see you soon.